We are here today to talk about commonly overlooked areas when establishing security resilience at work and at home. My name is Bree Fowler. I am a senior cybersecurity writer for CNET, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. And it's a really quick conversation, so we're going to get right to it. Whichever of you would like to go first, if you could just quickly introduce yourself and just, what to you is, what does the threat landscape look like now when we're talking about, overlooked areas, dealing with work and at home? A lot has changed in the last couple of years.
Since you showed my logo, I guess I can start. My name is Shlomo Shapiro. I'm a principal engineer and associate partner at TechTeed Consulting here in Berlin, Germany. I'm really happy to be part of this show. It's super interesting. So, asking about the security landscape, I would say the biggest problem is SaaS from a security perspective. I have the impression that most companies completely ignore and underestimate the threat posed by their current SaaS landscape. They don't have control over anything. They essentially put blind trust into their SaaS landscape, their SaaS vendors. And in fact, what they do is they completely give up the kind of full ownership of their perimeter. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that companies actually make in security practices, that they let their kind of perimeter become like a thin fence with lots of holes and lots of ways in, lots of ways where attackers can game employees essentially into giving up something. And I believe that as an industry, we really need to catch up with reality here.
Great.
Yeah, and I'm Björn. I'm one of the founders of Front Row Europe, and I also take care about the office IT landscape in the company. I think for me, next to obviously this huge shift into cloud applications and that basically making your company perimeters very foggy and unclear where they start and where they end and what's under your control. The biggest change in my view is that people are just much more mobile. So when we want to make them productive, that means we have to deal with a much, much larger device graph than we did maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And that means that if we don't want to arm everybody with like very dedicated devices, then we have a always BYOD environment, at least on the mobile devices. And in conjunction with these more cloud tools, it basically means that we have both new attack vectors on the devices and both new attack vectors on the applications that are different to manage than in past times.
Yeah, so looking at that, both when we're talking about SaaS and the cloud, there's just so many working parts, so many things moving that people in charge need to manage to protect security. I guess the $10,000 question is, how do you manage that? How do you juggle all that and make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks?
Well, you need to exercise tight control. You need to make sure that every application you introduce into your stack uses federated authentication against your primary identity provider. Like, one of the worst things to have are accounts in applications that you don't really know about, that stay active when people are leaving, or where they maybe never rotate passwords, where they maybe don't even have multi-factor authentication enabled. And it's just, that's how you give up control. So federated authentication is one of the easiest and most important countermeasures. However, you fall prey to these SaaS tags. There's even a website dedicated, SaaS.tags, which lists how all the companies essentially charge you extra and double and triple just for having proper authentication in place.
Yeah, I think that's one of the aspects that I really hate is that we have a lot of SaaS companies out there that treat security as an enterprise feature and basically try to make a quick $10K per year on just more robust security features. I think that should be something we should all in the industry really push for, that this is not a good business practice.
Right. I mean, I always think about that when I go to trade shows and I see just so much marketing and so many different companies. It must be really hard for security professionals to just figure out what works best for them and to make sure that all of those pieces fit together correctly.
Yeah, I think in general, the way that we look at it is we try to take a risk-based approach, and that we try to understand like what are the fast-growing attack vectors and risk factors for our specific industry and application stack that we're on, and try to manage that to the best of our abilities. But of course, there's also not the 100% security if you don't want to disconnect everything from the internet. And even then, I think I read like this week on Heise Security some article about how there are attack vectors being discussed in terms of just getting from completely disconnected machine via the RAM information exfiltration tactics. So the way that we look at it is we want to find the right balance between security and productivity on the application stack, because if we lock people down too much, then of course they will build up a shadow IT that's even less under the control. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of companies are making in terms of security practice, is they put a perceived security at the top of the agenda and try to lock people out of being productive, while that actually makes them much less secure in the long run, because then employees will basically build up their own IT outside of the tightly controlled IT environment. So in our view, it's about balance and a risk-based approach, and then navigating that as we go along. I think I think it was last week's macOS release is a good example, right? Where we basically said, okay, this fixes a lot of actual critical security holes on the endpoints, but Apple decided to release it in a state where it actually kills network connections and doesn't play nice with third-party network dependent applications. And then I think we are at a mid-sized company is not in the state where we can fix that, right? Where you can either bite the bullet and kill network connectivity on an unknown number of devices and plugging other holes, or you wait for Apple to get their stuff together and release a fix. And I think that's the world that we live in, is you can't have 100% security. You have to take a conscious risk-based approach and try to manage that proactively.
Well, maybe .0 is the actual beta. So, I mean, the thing that we discussed actually really plugs in with the previous talk that we heard about the security department being approachable. So same here, if we want our security to be effective, it has to be for the user, embracing and enabling the user to actually do their job. The moment security gets in the way, the users will find another way to do their job. And that's why it's always important to kind of be approachable as an IT department and think your security policies from the user and their job that they need to do.
Yeah.
So that you make sure that the kind of path of least resistance of the user doesn't actually circumvent your security.
Yeah, I think you can look at it at very simple examples. The success of WeTransfer.com is a success against IT departments, right? It's because IT departments did a shitty job and didn't allow people to share relevant work files with the clients, other colleagues, because they had too tight restrictions on it. And then people just circumvented. So it's a good example if any of the audience wants to run just a message trace on the outgoing mails, is how many of those contain WeTransfer links. And you can't really protect against that, except making sure that your colleagues feel that they are being supported in their productivity and not constantly are, let's say, blindsided and getting shut down for valid concerns or things that they actually want to do. So it's really about the collaboration and finding the right balance between productivity and security.
Yeah, people definitely, employees hate friction. They hate having to, deal with extra red tape and trying to, just get their job done. But at the same time, people are one of the biggest variables when it comes to security. You can buy the best tech out there, you can set the best practices in place, but if they're too restrictive, people will use shadow IT. They will find a back door that's just going to circumvent things and make things easier for them. I guess how do you deal with people? How do you manage people and like you said, make the IT department approachable, but also make sure that people aren't, creating their own set of best practices for how to use IT?
My personal recommendation is think of your users more as citizen developers who need to be enabled to make use of your IT environment to actually manage their own jobs and provide coaching and consulting internally for your customers, the users, to enable them to actually make use of the systems you provide. Typical example is, let's say somebody needs to have a simple work management tool, and then they go and buy Jira because nobody told them that in Microsoft 365 there is Planner Premium, which is a not well-marketed product, which actually does a lot of what people need. But the IT didn't make it easy to use that or even find it. So some department went and bought something external that creates a lot more problems from an IT perspective. So this is about being approachable and helping and reaching out a helping hand, actually, and always thinking about user enablement first.
Yeah, I think this is definitely one example or one good approach to take. I think the other aspect is also in a lot of companies, it's very hard for users to figure out, like, how do I get access to a tool that I need and what tools are actually supported by the company. Of course, there are, if you are like in a large corporate, there are solutions for this, but let's talk about mid-cap companies that have 100 employees or 200. So it's too large that you don't know all of the tools anymore, but it's not large enough to have some corporate, application directory. And I think for that, we try to do very pragmatic stuff. We have like a SharePoint database that people can search for what tools are available. We use ChatGPT to write the descriptions of the tool so that it actually contains keywords that people might be looking for. And at the same time, we actually, if people want to try out new tools, we actually like it if they use their federated authentication, like the Office 365 authentication or Google Workspace authentication, to see that, because then we can actually see that there's a new application in the stack and we can tightly control what data it has access to. I think it's much more opaque if people just sign up with username and password somewhere on something, then you basically don't really have a trace on where they're going. And we try then to understand what the needs are and then try to guide them to the, let's say, right tools that we can support them. I think that the other aspect is, I think what you mentioned as citizen developers is, I think a lot of companies, in my personal opinion, manage their IT incorrectly. They manage it as a defender of the status quo. They manage it more as a facility management unit that has to keep the lights on. And there's in very few IT organizations the goal to make people more productive and actually reap the benefits from, for example, new software releases. But as the world has switched to a SaaS model, which is a subscription model, you need to manage the IT different in the sense that, well, this is not a product I bought and then I write it off over 3 years and then maybe I look at if there's a new version, but you have like continuous new releases and features, and you actually want to reap the productivity benefits of those. And that is not something you can handle within the IT department. So the way that we do that is we look for in the organization for the people that are enthusiastic about technology, are enthusiastic about improving, that actually like to read a manual or watch a video. And then we make them evangelists for the stack. And then we have like a monthly meeting on our core applications where we review what is in the release notes, how do we want to actually leverage that. We support that process from the IT side, but we don't guide it. I think that something like project plan is a good example. You don't understand typically in an IT team what projects look like, how they need to be managed, what are typical tasks, which of those are recurring. So we need people in the actual business divisions to have that technical understanding and be able to drive application adoption. And I think that's what we try to do there with these kind of, let's say, evangelist meetings per core application component.
So when it comes to mistakes, all companies make mistakes when it comes to security. Security in software is always a learning and an ongoing process. What is the biggest mistake that companies make when they're managing all of this and trying to keep everything in line? And what's the one thing that they need to remember, especially if something bad does happen with security?
Yeah. Biggest mistake is SaaS underestimating the missing perimeter, not having control over all that. But the thing that you should remember is actually backups and data possession. So in SaaS, backups are really hard and often simply not available. So when something bad happens and you don't have a backup, it's probably going to be even worse. So start from a backup.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, a lot of companies don't really have a robust understanding of identity of their employees, or even also other people that they collaborate with, like freelancers. And that often baffles me. Like the amount of, for example, personal Google accounts that are used to manage, for example, Google Analytics data. Is baffling to me. And I think the amount, if I look at companies and look at, okay, they're using Macs, but they're not using managed Apple identities. And that just baffles me. So I think next to obviously what you mentioned is most companies need to deal today with digital identities. And my feeling is that there's rarely someone that feels responsible for that in the organization. Like, what is our core identity provider? Are we sure that on all the different stacks that we're using, we actually have an understanding on how the identities work, and do we have them under control? Because the more people log into some cloud application on a personally owned device, then if you don't even are able to manage that identity to, for example, lock that user out of certain aspects, the more difficult it is to mitigate damages.
Great. Well, I think that we are pretty much at time, but this has been a super interesting conversation, and I thank both of you for taking part in this.